Greetings. Welcome back to this episode of Theologically Driven. Today we're continuing our series through studying the Bible. The next section we're going to talk about is the historical books. So we're joined again by Dr. Dunham. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're thinking about the historical books. Maybe first of all, why are they called the historical books? Maybe give us an overview of the content, and then how do they fit into the broader narrative?
Yeah, so we typically call them historical books based on an early Christian tradition that they deal with the history of ancient Israel. This tradition goes back to Jerome and the Septuagint, which tended to categorize these books in terms of giving us an overview of the chronology of ancient Israel. In the Hebrew Bible division, it's typically seen as a three-part canon, and so this portion would fall into what they call the former prophets, and they link the former prophets as Joshua to Kings, and then the latter prophets would be the prophetical books that we know of as Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. But in this case, historical books really focuses on the fact that they give us the life of the nation of Israel in the land with Joshua until their exile, essentially, to Babylon. So it's those are bookends, the conquest of Canaan, and then exile out of the land once again, sort of form a frame around this history.
Yeah. Now, a lot of times, or most of the historical books are all narrative, and so truth is communicated through those. This is different than someone giving a passage or giving a sermon or illustrating a point. When we're reading through narrative, what are the things we're looking for to pull the theological truth that would really apply to today?
Yeah, narrative can be tricky because the narrator, the writer, doesn't always overtly tell us how we're to view a given character. In other words, sometimes it's unclear or ambiguous as to whether we're supposed to see what this character does as good or bad. And so we have to really be attentive readers. We have to be careful readers. And I usually suggest looking for clues, particularly focusing on what a character says. Hebrew narrative often develops characters through dialogue. And so what a character says will be a clue. Sometimes the narrator does say something overtly like what this character did was evil in the sight of the Lord. Then you know that's a moral evaluation that we can take of that character. At other times, sometimes characters can fall into certain patterns that might lead us to expect them to be bad or good. In other words, if they're falling into a pattern of an earlier good character, that might hint that they're good, or an earlier bad character that might hint that they're not good or bad. So clues within the narrative itself can be helpful. I think if we zoom out a little bit, narrative in general in the Old Testament, I think a lot of the challenge comes from it can be confusing to keep straight the chronology. So sometimes it's helpful to have a good study Bible or a book on the dates and times that will help you. The one I usually recommend, Andrew Steinman's book on biblical chronology, I think is the best right now. But if you sort of have an idea of the sequence and flow, that will also help you kind of get a picture as to what these events mean, and it helps as a reference point for how God's providence is working on the lives of the people of ancient Israel.
Yeah, so I know you probably could do this off the top of your head here. So what might be some of the major figures in the chronology of the historical books? What would be, if someone wanted to study through and read through the narratives, what would be the major headings that they would want to look at?
Yeah, so I would say the conquest probably happens 1406 to 1399 BC, so that's when Joshua is leading them into the land, and it's about a 7-year period, that battle sequence time. And then scriptures say that after Joshua's death and then after the death of the elders who knew Joshua, that they sort of lapse into this recurring apostasy that we see taking place in the book of Judges. The chronology of Judges is a little bit difficult because if you just tally all the judgeships of the various characters, it doesn't quite fit. What the best solution seems to be that some of the judges are contemporaries of one another and that they're more regionally situated, governing certain areas. But that takes us down into the 12th century. We can sort of establish the kings once again when we get to, say, Saul, who's about 1050, 1049 BC, to David, who's 1010 BC to 970 BC, and then that's when Solomon is building the temple, and that's a key date, 970. He concludes, that's the beginning of his sole reign, and then he concludes it, it says in the text, or he begins building it in the 480th year after the Exodus, so this puts us about 966 BC. So those are just some kings that can be helpful. And then the exile, taking us down toward the end of Judah's history. So we have the fall of the northern kingdom in 723 or 722 BC, and then the fall of the southern kingdom in 587 BC. And so those are kind of bookends. The last datable event in Kings comes with the release of Jehoiakim in exile, and his death is usually put around 561 BC. So roughly we're speaking of a time period from 1400 to 560s BC. So it's quite a long period of time that it's covering. So it's helpful to have a sense of that history. There are a lot of biblical scholars who sort of discount the need to study the history, but I always like to emphasize that these are real people experiencing real events, and so we shouldn't disconnect it from its historical context.
Yeah, because if you don't know the historical context or the what's actually happening there, then you can't pull the truth that's there, because that's how it was communicated to us, is through narrative and these accounts. So thinking about major figures, and now let's think about major theological themes that might come up. So as we're reading through Joshua, Judges, these books, what are some of the major themes that we're going to run into?
Yeah, so I would say one major theme would be God's covenant faithfulness. I think God is the primary character in these narratives. And so he shows his faithfulness, particularly, say, in the book of Joshua, where he's aiding them and helping them to get the land, the territory that he's promised to them. In Judges, the problem is that they're not faithful to the Lord in turn. And you can sort of see this even in the juxtaposition of reading the first chapter of Joshua with reading the first chapter of Judges. In the first chapter of Joshua, Moses has died, and the Lord very clearly speaks to Joshua and tells him what he must do. In Judges, we have the death of Joshua, but there seems to be some uncertainty. The tribes are saying, what are we supposed to do? Who's going up first? And so this already casts an ominous note for the book that they're sort of taking matters into their own hands, which is repeated in that well-known phrase toward the end that everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes. There was no king in Israel. And so God's faithfulness in Joshua, the people's unfaithfulness in Judges. When we get to Samuel to Kings, God's faithfulness will be exhibited in providing the right kind of king for the nation, which ends up being David. I sort of see Saul as a concession because the people wanted a king at the wrong time and from the wrong motives, even though having a king really was the plan all the way back to Abraham. I think David maybe would have been the original king if they hadn't sort of misfired with trying to speed up the timeline. So they get Saul. Saul's a concession. But David is kind of the right kind of king in his heart disposition to the Lord. Now, that's not to say he's not without his flaws. Clearly, he has major sins that really impact the latter half of his reign, the latter stages of his reign. So even in that, though, God is going to use David to eventually bring the Messiah. And so I would see also there's a messianic hope that's in the narratives of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. There's this idea that God has a covenant with David, and through David's coming descendant, he's going to bring a reign of peace that will be perpetual, that will bring prosperity. This coincides well with what the prophets also reveal about the future reign of the Messiah. So this Davidic hope of the coming Messiah is a keynote. And so you sort of have these parallel tracks of God's faithfulness and the people's unfaithfulness. And then toward the end of Kings, 2 Kings 17, you have a long excursus where the narrator says that the people go into exile because they've been unfaithful to the Lord. So that kind of brings us back almost to the time of the Judges, that once again the people have been unfaithful to their covenant obligations, and so they're eventually expelled from the land. So those would be some of the big themes. There are a lot of minor themes that weave into that, but seeing God's work in being faithful to his covenant, in redemptively working to his glory, seeing a doxological strain to everything that's going on, I think is an important interpretive understanding to take.
Yeah. Do you think, so thinking about the cycle there that you mentioned, where now the people have a king and then they're unfaithful to the covenant, so God sends them into exile. Do you think it's to show them their, like, just any human king is not enough to save you? Like, it seems like the people they're looking around at the nations and they're thinking, we want a king, we want to be like them, we want to be like the nations, that would make us great and powerful, but that's not really where they needed to be placing their hope. They need to be placing their faith and hope in God. And God gave them what they wanted, not perfect, but still David, who's a good king. But then eventually it just, the kings all are terrible. I mean, they're, I think so. The northern kingdom had, 19 kings? None of them were good, and only 8 of the southern, if you classify as good. But, it's to show, like, you can't place your hope in this. You need to be looking for something better.
Yeah.
Does that?
Yeah, I think so. I was teaching through the book of Judges a week or two ago, and one of the things we discussed in that book is how often the angel of the Lord appears. The angel of the Lord appears more often in Judges than in any other Old Testament book. And so we were kind of discussing why would that be the case. And one idea is that the goal was to have a theocracy in which God was king. However, very quickly they sort of degenerate into this moral chaos and apostasy, and so the angel of the Lord takes a prominent role. In those opening chapters, he rebukes them and he speaks on behalf of the Lord. He says, "You didn't obey me, even though I brought you out of Egypt." He's speaking as Yahweh, which is a reason I see that as a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ. And so the idea was that Christ was the divine warrior in his pre-incarnate state that would have led them into the land and given them peace because God is king. But because of their selfish motivations and other things, they wanted a human king. And it seems, to your point, that the judges get progressively worse, and in many ways the kings get progressively worse. There are glimpses here and there of good ones, Josiah being the final good king. But even in that trajectory, it's instilling, I think, in the people a hope that there must be a better solution. There's a coming Messiah who will be the right kind of king, who will reign in the right kind of way, and that every human king prior to that falls short of reaching that standard. And this is another reason I see that Scripture is true and trustworthy, because it doesn't present these characters as if they had no flaws. A lot of times in ancient literature, particularly, let's say, Egyptian literature, the kings really were propagandists to show how great they were, and they seemingly had no flaws. They were characterized as almost supernatural heroes. But in Scripture, we see very flawed human kings who cause us to pine for the coming king who will reign righteously.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is why the details of the events are important. So I'm thinking of 2 Samuel 7, when God makes his covenant with David. He promises a king after the line of David. So if the people are looking for their coming king, they know it's going to come from David's lineage. So then you get to Matthew and the genealogies, and you see that Jesus being born fits that description. So if you're not looking for those things, if you're not investigating the narratives there, we might miss some of that. So one of the other very difficult passages that people will often bring up is the conquest under Joshua. So how can God be just in sending his people to slaughter these nations? So I know you've done a lot of work on this. As people reading it, they may struggle with that. What are some of the ways you've worked through it?
Yeah, I admit that this is one of the more challenging texts of Scripture that we kind of have to wrestle through. I don't think that we should pretend that it's not a difficult passage thinking through it. And I've talked to a lot of people who have misgivings about it. I've even talked to skeptics that point to this as a reason for not believing in Scripture and in God. But I think if you take it in the context of all that's going on, a couple things rise to the surface. Number one, it's not evident that the conquest was actually an intention to commit what sometimes is viewed as genocide. And so that's a controversial view, but essentially, as I would understand how genocide is typically defined, it means that it's a targeting of ethnicities specifically because of their ethnic or religious commitments or identity. And in the conquest, the goal is for God, who is holy and just, to both judge evil and sin that has been happening in the land. And recalling to mind that Abraham was first warned that the sin of the Amorites was not yet full some 7 centuries before the conquest happens. So there's a lot of time between the initial announcement of judgment and when it actually takes place. But God in his holiness is going to dwell in the land, a land that's been polluted by every conceivable kind of perversion and sin. It's commonly acknowledged that the Canaanites practiced every form of sexual deviance. They committed all kinds of abortion, infanticide, other sorts of things. So they were a society that was thoroughly corrupt in their worship. They worshipped pagan gods, and so all of these sins were piling up, and eventually God, in a sense, deputized the Israelites as his agents of judgment. So keeping in mind God's glory, his holiness, he's coming into the land in order to dwell there, and so the land must be purified for his glory. And so I understand that in a culture in which we see a lot of the same patterns of behavior perhaps happening in our culture that happened in ancient Canaan, that I've said sometimes that it seems like the Canaanites become the good guys when our culture looks more and more like Canaan. But if we understand that God in his righteousness and holiness has a right over life, human life, he had the right to take life in the flood. He has the right to take life even in tragic circumstances throughout human history. He has the right also in even the conquest of Canaan to take life. Keeping those things in mind, there are other things that we could say, but I typically point to the fact that God is a just, sovereign, holy God, and so his intention is to dwell with his people. But if creation is suffering because of human sin, that human sin needs to be eradicated, and that territory needs to be sanctified so that God can dwell in the midst of his people.
Right. And it's not like it's not like the people outside of Israel are without excuse. So I'm thinking of Romans 1. Paul talks about all people have a knowledge of God, but they've suppressed the truth in unrighteousness. And so in some ways, God has a right to do what he will, because he has made it clear what he expects of all people, even outside of the gospel and scripture that way. Any other resources? You mentioned towards the beginning the book on the chronology of the historical books in the Old Testament. Any other helpful resources that you've read recently that you might, for people studying these types of things?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of good commentaries. If you're working through different books in the historical books section, I would recommend looking up the recommended book list from the seminary, the DBTS recommended book list, because we'll typically list what we see as the top 5 commentaries on each book. So that's a helpful resource. There are other studies of the historical books. David Howard has written one that's kind of an overview of the historical books. That might be a helpful one to consult. The Steinman volume, it's called From Abraham to Paul, and it's a look at biblical chronology. That is a book I use quite often just as a touch point to remember the sequence of events that took place. So all of those are good resources. There are probably more academic and scholarly resources that look into the details of the historical books that might be helpful to some that are a little more advanced, but generally speaking, a good commentary will give you what you need to know in order to understand what's going on in these books.
Yeah, I've been meaning to ask you about. We'll leave this in, but so if you're not a seminary student or a pastor, maybe you can tune this part out. But some of the new Zondervan series has been doing the discourse analysis emphasis in their commentaries. Have you looked at any of those? And then what do you think about that?
Yeah. I've looked at a few of them. I think there's a place for a commentary like that, but I like to balance that kind of a commentary with other commentaries that follow a more traditional exegetical model, so that yes, it's good to see the flow of thought within the text, but you also need to understand the world behind the text, and sometimes those particular commentaries don't have as much information about the world behind the text, what was going on culturally and in the context of the author. So I think they can be helpful and they have a place. There are ones such as handbooks on the Hebrew text that Baylor has put out, and those can be very helpful when you're looking at exegetical things in the text, but they really are pretty weak on giving you the background and some of filling out the picture of the context as a whole. So I use them, but they're probably not often in my top 5.
Yeah. Yeah, they serve a specific purpose. Yeah, I looked at one, and which I don't want to judge the whole by the one, but I had looked at one because I was preparing for a sermon, so there was a new commentary on that particular passage, and I don't want to say who it was, but I didn't find that I wasn't getting anything there that the top commentaries that we would recommend didn't have.
Right.
Like I was almost a little disappointed by some of the,
Right.
It almost seemed like a lack of contribution, whereas I was expecting more there. But
because a good commentary will give you both background and will be sensitive to literary features.
Exactly.
So ideally, it combines both. And if we approach Scripture in historical, theological, and literary ways, and if we bracket out the historical and even to some degree the theological, you're left with only the literary, and it's good, but it doesn't quite get you to the finish line.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for that rabbit trail on commentaries and for talking about the historical books today. Thank you for listening to Theologically Driven. We're a podcast from Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. If you'd like to learn more about our seminary, just go to dbts.edu.